I took my camera and went up in the watershed, photographing my evidence wherever I found it. Those are the words of Jacob Riis, a Danish immigrant who arrived in America in 1870 at the age of 21, like so many immigrants at the time, with broken English, no money, and a dream of finding work as a carpenter. Within a few short years, he would do something extraordinary. He would point his camera into the darkest corners of New York City and capture images so shocking, so undeniable, that they would make a future president march into his office and declare, "I have read your book, and I have come to help." Hey, it's Andrew with the Isle of Misfit Books, where we discuss books that have struck me and stuck with me in my 25 years of working in rare books. And today we're going to be taking a look at Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives, first published in 1890. So imagine it's 1870 and 21-year-old Jacob Riis steps off a boat in the New York harbor. He has broken English, $40 that were loaned to him. He's just been rejected by his childhood sweetheart, and he has come to America, as so many other immigrants have at that time, in search of a new life, a new hope, and a new job. Hoping to find work as a carpenter, he had apprenticed as a carpenter for about 4 years. And as is the case with so many immigrants coming to America from Europe at that time, he quickly realizes that America is not the paradise that he was told it would be. Riis experienced the precariousness and degradation of the hapless immigrant, often jobless, hungry, and homeless. More than once he spent the night in a police lodging house. At times, he was on the verge of suicide. But his suffering wasn't pointless. Every night spent on a police station floor, every moment of hunger and desperation, it would all become preparation for his life's mission. In 1877, 7 years after arriving in America, Riis finally caught a break. He became a police reporter for the New York Tribune, and now his job was to report on what he had been experiencing. Riis was assigned to cover The Bend, the most notorious slum in Manhattan, where families of 6 to 8 people lived in rooms 12 feet by 10 feet, where children worked from the moment they could pull a thread, and where English was practically an unknown language. Other reporters might document these conditions with detached professionalism or avoid the subject with disdain. But Riis, he'd lived it. He knew firsthand what it was like to be hungry, homeless, and invisible to respectable society. And here's where our story gets both brilliant and dangerous. In the tenements, there were no windows in interior rooms. The narrow staircases doubled as dark wells, and families were crammed into spaces where the sunlight never penetrated. How do you show people something that's deliberately kept in the dark? Photography had made some substantial advances in recent years. George Eastman discovered how to make film on a roll that could be unspooled, and cameras now had been reduced to the size that they could be collapsed and folded into the size of a valise or a small suitcase. So still not the portable cameras or the phones that we're used to, but at least portable. Riis bought himself a camera and taught himself photography, and more than once nearly killed himself in the process. Trying to use artificial light without a steady source of light meant what they called flashlights, or what we would call flash bulbs. However, these were very unwieldy at the time. The cartridges had to be fired from a revolver. So the explosive noise would wake entire buildings and cause disturbances. And listen to this account from Riis himself. Some idea of what is meant by a sanitary cleaning up in these slums may be gained from the account of a mishap I met with once in taking a flashlight picture of a group of blind beggars in one of the tenements down here. When the blinding effect of the flash had passed away and I could see once more, I discovered that a lot of paper and rags that hung on the wall were ablaze. There were 6 of us, 5 blind men and women who knew nothing of their danger, and myself, in an attic room with a dozen crooked, rickety chairs between us and the street. The thought, how were they ever to be got out, made my blood run cold as I saw the flames creeping up the wall, and my first impulse was to bolt for the street and shout for help. The next was to smother the fire myself, and I did, with a vast deal of trouble. Of course, fire was a huge problem in the tenements, so him coming in with his explosive flashlight twice caused fires and once nearly blinded him. So he's risking his life with this flash powder to document these horrible, unsanitary conditions. But he's not doing it for money or for fame or even because his job is demanding it of him. He's doing it because he remembers what it was like to live in these conditions. He remembers how horrible it was, and he has become a crusader, in effect, for improving these conditions. So by 1890, Riis had amassed a collection of photos, the like of which no one had ever seen before. Images from inside the tenements, the lodging houses, the sweatshops, the police stations. But here's the cruel irony. When How the Other Half Lives was first published in 1890, printing technology had not caught up to the photographic technology. The halftone process of printing, where you could actually essentially reproduce the photograph in a book, had not yet been developed. So while he had these images, in order for them to be printed, they had to be redrawn as line engravings and reduced in size, and the redrawing of them often suppressed detail, altered backgrounds, and everything was sort of softened or possibly even rearranged to make a more pleasing picture. That's just what the artists who were tasked with drawing these engravings tended to do. That was their training. But this was really not what Riis was about. It's not what it went counter to his whole point, which was to show very realistic images, snapshots, effectively, of poverty, of the tenements, of conditions in these slums. And yet, even in this watered-down form, with a reduced number of images, a reduced size of those images, and a reduced amount of detail conveyed through those images, even in that watered-down form, these images and Riis's own text, his reporting, had a dramatic impact on the public. Remember the future president that I mentioned earlier on? In 1895, a young police commissioner named Theodore Roosevelt read How the Other Half Lives and was so moved that he literally marched into Riis's office and said those famous words, "I have read your book, and I have come to help." So Riis took this young, ambitious police commissioner through the slums, through the tenements, through his old haunts, to introduce him to the people that he had reported on, to show him the conditions that actually existed at that time in the slums and in the tenements. Let's paint an image for you of what a tenement actually was in 1890. Imagine a brick building 4 to 6 stories high. Each floor houses 4 to 6 families. A set of rooms consists of 1 or 2 dark, windowless closets used as bedrooms, with a living room 12 feet by 10 feet, smaller than most people's bedrooms today. The staircase is a dark well in the center of the building. No direct ventilation is possible. You can imagine how swelteringly hot in the summer, an airless tomb, basically, for the people trying to sleep. And that's why people would sleep on the roofs, they would sleep on the fire escapes, they would find trucks on the street, they would sleep on the street. In the middle of July, a rain shower would be seen as a blessing from the heavens. But here's what makes it so much worse. These aren't just houses, they're factories. Now, the law said factory workers could only work 10 hours a day with a 45-minute dinner break. Children under 16 had to be able to demonstrate that they could read and write English, and no children under the age of 14 were allowed to work. The tenement defeated these laws with their sweatshops. In the tenements, children worked from dawn to dusk as soon as they are old enough to pull a thread. People ate while they worked. You were paid based on what you produced. You were paid per the cigar that you rolled. You were paid per the number of pairs of pants that you hemmed. You were paid by the number of paper bags that you glued together. And so you had to produce as much as physically possible in order to make ends meet and pay the rent. Often going to the sweater, as they were called, or the person who was running that particular sweatshop. This picture shows what a sober, patient, sturdy little thing she was, with that dull life wearing on her day by day. She got right up when asked and stood for her picture without a question and without a smile. "What kind of work do you do?" I asked, thinking to interest her while I made ready. "I scrubs," she replied promptly, and her look guaranteed that what she scrubbed came out clean. There was an economic trap at play here. Immigrants would come to New York, arrive in Manhattan, where there were communities, neighborhoods, sorted ethnically or culturally. Newcomers would arrive with limited knowledge of English, desperate to find work, and essentially finding themselves pressed into working in these sweatshops. So families were paying high rents for these horrible conditions. Landlords were making enormous profits, 25% versus the 7% that reformer Alfred T. White suggested would be appropriate for both making a profit and allowing for human dignity by making repairs, making improvements, making regular maintenance. The most insidious part was that the political system was designed to perpetuate these conditions through the practice of vote harvesting. Now, in these tenements and in these lodging houses or so-called hotels where desperate men, desperate workers could rent a plank or what looked sort of like a hammock, a piece of cloth stretched between two boards in a crowded, airless hall for 7 to 10 cents a night. Come election season, their votes could be bought for $1 to $1.50. In other words, your vote could buy you a month's worth of lodging. On the flip side, if you controlled hundreds or even thousands of these votes, then you effectively controlled who got elected. So is it any surprise then that the elected party would defend these slumlords and these landlords and these hotel owners who effectively bought their candidate's election? By controlling who got elected, the slumlords and the hotel owners ensured the conditions that kept people desperate enough to sell their votes. How the Other Half Lives is a fascinating tour of Manhattan at this time, of the slums, of the workshops, the sweatshops, of the various immigrant communities. You had African Americans fleeing to the north from the south. You had people from all parts of Europe, also from Asia, from Africa. It was, in some ways, the melting pot that we're always taught about, but of course each group kept to its own largely, and so you had these enclaves, these little individual neighborhoods. Riis's prose and his pictures really walk us through New York at that time, and it's fascinating. However, I will caution you, if you go to seek out this text to read it for yourself, Riis was a product of his time, and he leans very heavily on stereotypes, often verging into out-and-out racism. I think what counts for Riis is that his images always show, if not dignity, at least the humanity of his subjects, regardless of their ethnicity. Crucially, he never argues for the exclusion of one group or another from the benefits of any reform that he is proposing or would like to see. Riis seemed to believe that any negative cultural traits would disappear once people had access to better housing and more sanitary conditions. So what did Riis actually accomplish? He attended and reported on the Tenement House Commission of 1884, and this was really the inspiration for what went on to become How the Other Half Lives. The New York Tenement House Act of 1901 mandated better lighting, ventilation, fire safety, and room space. The demolition of Mulberry Bend and Five Points neighborhoods grew out of How the Other Half Lives, along with the creation of many more parks and playgrounds. Over 40,000 windows were cut through interior walls to let in light and air. Beyond the immediate impact in the 1890s and the early 1900s of Riis's work, it had an even longer lasting impact through the Great Depression and the New Deal. And this is according to the Library of Congress. It took the passage of another generation and the advent of the New Deal during the Great Depression of the 1930s for activists to rediscover Riis. Inspired by Riis's stirring call to action in How the Other Half Lives, they invoked his name to support ideas foreign to his thinking, providing jobs and housing for the poor through government programs and tax dollars. In the 1940s, Riis's photographs were rediscovered, and he entered the narrative of photographic history as a groundbreaking pioneer. Riis essentially invented photojournalism as we know it. His techniques and his approach influenced everyone from Louis Hine to Dorothea Lange. Now there's another potential influence that I found fascinating, and check this out. So Riis devotes a chapter to street Arabs, or homeless children, and he notes how the Children's Aid Society would attempt to place homeless, orphaned youths with families in the far west, though sometimes they would wind up returning to the city that they knew out of a homesickness despite the miserable conditions. And so he goes on to tell the following story, and this is a quote. "I helped once to see a party off for Michigan. In the party was a boy who had been at the 5 Points House of Industry," that was one of these orphanages, basically, "and brought along as his only baggage a padlocked and iron-bound box that contained all his wealth, 2 little white mice of the friendliest disposition. They were going with him out to live on the fat of the land in the fertile West, where they would never be wanting for a crust. Alas, for the best laid plans of mice and men. I saw their owner some months later in the old home at the 5 Points. He had come back, walking part of the way, and was now pleading to be sent out once more. His face fell when I asked him about the mice. They had so much corn to eat, he said, and they couldn't stand it. They burned all up inside, and then they busted." The story, but also the juxtaposition there of that phrase, "live on the fat of the land," immediately followed by "the best laid plans of mice and men." The fact that Steinbeck was writing that his novel of Mice and Men in the 30s, just at a time when Riis's work was experiencing this resurgence. I don't have any proof, but I like to think that Steinbeck read this passage and found at least some inspiration for his novel. His photographs didn't just document poverty, they demanded that Americans confront it. His friendship with Theodore Roosevelt didn't just reform New York's police department, it helped shape a future president's understanding of social justice. And his book didn't just expose how the other half lives. It forced America to ask what it owed that other half. "Think ye that building shall endure, which shelters the noble, but crushes the poor?" That's the couplet with which Riis ends his book. That question was relevant in 1890, and it is just as relevant today. Of course, the specific conditions that Riis documented in the slums of Manhattan have been largely alleviated and changed through law, improved through law. But inequality and housing crises and the invisibility of poverty still remain persistent American challenges. How the Other Half Lives remains a masterpiece of social documentation, despite its flaws. It's a reminder that the most powerful journalism often comes from those who have lived or who are living in the conditions that are being documented. And with the growing professionalism and credentialism of our journalists, of our media, especially in the legacy media, you can see how this becomes more and more difficult, how the people who might once have documented these abject conditions no longer have any connection to those conditions, to those places, those people. And I'm sure that the modern day Jacob Riis is out there, that they are out there on YouTube, on TikTok, on Substack. That being said, I've also seen plenty of channels that specialize in tours of ghettos and poverty and human misery for clicks and profit, rather than encouraging change and compassion. What social issues today need their own Jacob Riis? Are there any Jacob Riises out there that you are aware of that you could leave in the comments? I would love to hear any people, any channels, any journalists out there who are doing something similar. The first edition from 1890 is a book that you will see for a really nice copy in the $2,000 to $3,000 range, which is not terribly expensive for a book of its importance and of that time period. But I think that's in part because the illustrations are really not what Riis intended. And so I would highly recommend, if you are interested in the photographs, interested in the text is fascinating. It gives you a taste, not a pleasant taste, but it definitely gives you a taste of what life must have been like for those immigrant populations at that time. Pretty horrible, but fascinating. And his photographs really drive that home. So any reprint that includes the photographs is what I would recommend. I'll try to find links in the description box below. So I hope you've enjoyed this brief tour of an incredible and important American photo book, a pioneering work. Best way to support the channel would be to click like, please, and subscribe. I'll be putting more videos like this out in the coming days. And if you are at all interested, I have links to my own books. I've published a couple of novels, one a fantasy, one an action adventure, and I will have links to those in the description box below. All right, that's all I've got for you today. Thanks for stopping by. I'll see you in the next one.